Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfurth, and Redbridge's Kos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. Good morning and welcome back, Curtinistas, men and women of Australia. I'm Nick Dyrenfurth, co-host of Curtin's Cast. Welcome to my fabulous co-host, Cosmos, Kung Fu Kos Samaras. How are you, Cosy?
Good, thank you.
What a crazy week, Cos. Another crazy week in politics. It's one sort of now gets a sort of picture of what it would have been like to live through the 1930s. We've had Donald Trump threatening to destroy Iranian civilization. We've had him posting pictures of him Christ-like and then deleting them.
Attacking the Pope.
Attacking the Pope. That's a great idea,
Especially when your country's significantly populated by Hispanic Latinos and Catholics.
The Strait of Hormuz, open, not sure. I haven't checked this morning's news, but
no, it's still closed.
We are living through an age of hyperpolitics, Cos. And it is leading to political upheaval across the globe, and not just in the Middle East. You and I have been keeping a very close eye on developments in Britain and the European continent, the echoes of which have been heard loud and clear in Australia, with the system fragmenting in real time, the major so-called legacy parties of the left and the right, the Social Democrats, the Conservatives, seeming to fall apart in real time, populists of the left and right, breaking through with insurgent force. Our guest today, we're going to pick his brain in particular about the recent surge of the Greens and their eco-populist leader, Zach Polanski. But it's clear that the centre isn't holding. The centre does appear to be holding in bits and pieces, but we're very lucky to have an expert with us this morning, Cos, to lead us through exactly what's happening in the UK and Europe. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Ben Wellings, Associate Professor Ben Wellings from Monash University. He is the Associate Dean International in the Faculty of Arts. He is an expert on the politics of nationalism in the UK and contemporary Europe, and the part played by national identity in political polarisation within and between nations and states. His current research focuses on nationalism and disintegration in the UK and EU and the politics of the Anglosphere. Ben regularly appears commenting on national and international politics for the ABC, Channel 10, Bloomberg, Sky News, Al Jazeera and the BBC, the Beebs. Ben Wellings, welcome to Curtin's Cast.
Hello, Nick, and hello, Kos.
It's fabulous to have you here, mate.
Thank you.
I could ask the obvious question: what in the world is going on in the world? Why don't we start with what I've been terming Trump bump 2.0? Trump's chaotic leadership in a sort of second iteration of this. The first bout was after 2024, when he decided to wage tariff war against most of the world, including allies, ostensible allies here in Australia, and it produced here in Australia and Canada and elsewhere. Its effect was to reverse the trend of incumbents losing office, whether they were left or right, by incumbent governments, Anthony Albanese, Mark Carney, appealing to a sense of nationalism and sovereignty in the face of Trump's uncertain, to put it mildly, uncertain political strategy. We now seem to be potentially having a second version of this, whilst the Danish Social Democrats suffered their worst result in 120 years. They managed to hang on through a third term. I'm very interested to pick your brain about what happened in Hungary as well. What's your take on the current impact of Trumpism?
Well, Nick, I might go back to your first question, what on earth's going on? And I suppose a two-word answer is structural change.
Yeah.
And then we're just living through the structural change, and that pops up in its sort of various local manifestations, which we have to sort of understand through, local contexts and political traditions that operate in our different polities. So the Trump bump, or two. My question is, when are we not in a bump, right? Is it just, when's the downtime? So what's the norm? But I think what's interesting here is an emerging distinction between Trump and MAGA. I think that the way I was thinking about this when Trump came in was the second time round was, well, okay, this time they've got a plan. There's a bunch of people behind Trump, and they know what they're doing. Like Vance is sort of one of these kind of figures, isn't he? Seems to have a plan, seems to be a coherent ideology that they can translate into policy. But I'm beginning to wonder now if that was actually me projecting something onto this, because there is a growing distance between Trump and MAGA. We know that MAGA is not happy about Trump seemingly being convinced by Netanyahu that this second war will be a good idea. Whatever it was, it wasn't sort of well thought through, or there weren't people around Trump to sort of say, have you really thought hard about this? The Israelis are overselling this, as they often do. They seem very good on the tactical stuff and taking out leaders, but the big picture stuff seems to evade them at the moment. So there aren't those kind of like checks and balances on Trump himself. And then, as Kos mentioned, why you would seek to, we know they like to sort of, antagonize the libtards, but why you would then start to do that to potential sources of your own support, because the Latino men started to vote for Trump in 2024 in a way. So, one of the conclusions is that they're just not very clever, actually, and that there isn't a plan behind this. And someone thought it would be funny to stick, Trump plus Christ into AI and see what you get. But all the kind of like the drip feed about, well, we posted it, then we deleted it, but it's still out there and you're still talking about it. And it's all like this sort of politics of distraction and Bannon's notion of flooding the zone.
The idea, though, Ben, that this was his first presidency, and I think the sort of first year or so of the second presidency, the accepted wisdom was that there was method to the madness. And this was part of sort of baiting left of centre types. It was distracted people from what they were doing. But I think you've got to the core of that there's a real tension there between the MAGA base and Trump. And Vance has been very quiet. It's clear that he opposed the second war in Iran, because the core promise of Trump, first and second presidencies, no forever wars. Now, I'm not suggesting that Iran is going to be for a forever war, although who knows how long this drag out. It's not a conventional war. It's asymmetric conflict.
Just on MAGA, Ben, your point about we projected our view of how sophisticated political operators will approach a second chance. And I think you're right. What we fail to understand is the MAGA movement and Trump kind of like stumbled on an opportunity. And what really struck me the most about that, well, what actually for me is evident of that, is his attack on the Pope. No sophisticated, deep thinking political operation office or anything of that sort would ever go there, because how deeply ingrained Catholicism is within very significant portions of the American constituency, especially in Hispanics. It is absolutely integrated in their culture. It is an absolute affront to do what he did. And that tells me he has no idea what he's doing. His office has no idea what they're doing. And really, they've stumbled on an opportunity which was given to them by, I would say, the industrialization, political industrialization of the Democrats.
Yeah, I think we have to start to consider that as a serious option. I mean, there was always the notion that he was, and this is like who we're talking about here, that Trump was, let's say, erratic, to put it nicely. But yes, you're right. The idea that there was a kind of sophisticated political operators who were given a second chance, it was kind of an open goal, and they seem to take it. But the way things have been rolling out in the second Trump presidency has been a series of own goals rather than an open goal. And I think that the so-called Liberation Day, just a little over a year ago, was a key moment where Trump stopped being this kind of figurehead for a populist international around the world, or at least in liberal democracies. And it just became clear that he was an American nationalist. And what that did to the right of politics in other liberal democracies were people say, well, particularly in Canada, I mean, we had it here, but in Canada, it was all those people on the right of Canadian politics who might have been really admiring what Trump was doing first time around were sort of like, well, actually, I really like Canada. I'm proud of being Canadian, and I don't want to be just a state of the US. And it shifted things, and we see that a little bit in Europe as well. But
they didn't get the memo in Australia, though, Ben. During the election, as Kos and I have remarked upon, we had Jacinta Price, using MAGA slogans, and the Trump connection for Dutton was toxic, and they weren't able to distance themselves from. They equivocated during the.
They still haven't, Nick. I mean, if you think about Trump since then, has criticised Australian troops, has slapped 100% tariffs on Australian-made pharmaceuticals, purely because his corporate interests over there in the US are demanding that the PBS here in this country is dismantled. He's attacked Australia in terms of not committing itself to his ill-planned escapades in Iran, and what we've seen from parts of the coalition criticising the Albanese government not actually working with Trump, and of course Trump-like ICE policies.
Most significant thing I've picked up there, and you've picked up, Kos, is the One Nation response. We had Pauline Hanson out there saying, mates, in a sort of geopolitical sense, should be, Albo should have been picking up the phone to Trump and offering sort of unqualified support. And I'm sorry, Pauline, that's not how international affairs works. If you want to go to war against a country of 90 million people, in a geopolitically turbulent and important part of the world, you're going to have to go in with a plan, and you're going to have to have the support of your allies. You can't barge in there and then look around and say, well, where's the cavalry? So I think you made the observation, Kos, and I made the observation a few weeks ago in the Australian. This is where I think we might see the ceiling on Hanson, because you can't run around, drape yourself in the flag, but when the acid test comes, you're seen to be on the America First team, not the Australia First team. And I think, Ben, that's where I'd like to pick up the conversation on what just happened in Hungary. Cool. I wouldn't say Australian politicos are experts. It's obviously it's a very different political system, but again, I thought a lot of the world was watching what happened because Viktor Orbán has been, he prefigured MAGA-style politics, and he's been the darling of MAGA. He's cozied up to Putin, and he lost badly. And I think we should maybe just explain who he lost to, because if there are any sort of social democrats or left of centre lefties out there who think that this was some kind of socialist or social democratic triumph, that they've got it badly wrong.
Yeah, keep the champagne in the fridge for the moment, because it's. I think, look, if you Peter Magyar is the name of the person who'll be leading Hungary politically now. And he set up a party only a couple of years ago called Tisha. And he was a former close political ally of Viktor Orbán, whose party Fidesz came out of the 1989 revolutions against communism. And it was explicitly a youth party. You had to be under 36 to be a member of it. And so it's kind of interesting to see
it
how
was more smaller liberal in the beginnings.
Yeah, I mean, in the context of not being a communist. So,
yes.
And those 1989 revolutions, of course, if you were any sort of Democrat, then you were opposed to communism. And Orbán himself and the party has gone on a trajectory from, let's say, liberalism in both its economic sense, towards illiberalism, and I think this is Hungary and Orbán's main contribution to politics of the last 20 years or so, is this idea of an illiberal democracy.
He boasted of it.
Yeah, and so this is why the focus was on Hungary. Orbán and Hungary were trailblazers in this regard. So, as you mentioned, this leader and this approach got a lot of attention from the MAGA movement. In some senses, you could sort of say this is what they would like America to look like, because once Fidesz got in 2010, they were able to change the system to their advantage, and to change the system in both an illiberal direction. So you curtail plurality of voices in the media, you stack the judiciary with your people, and you can sort of see the parallels with the US here in some of these MAGA approaches. And this spawned off, another kind of emulator in Poland. And gradually this idea of illiberal democracy grew, or just that you basically had the outward show of a democracy because you had elections which were free but not necessarily fair because of the amount of airtime, if you like, or attention that the governing party could bring to bear in these kind of things. So the reason that people got excited about this election in Hungary was because this trailblazer in the figure of Orbán was knocked off his perch, and he was knocked off in spectacular fashion. So Peter Magyar and the Tisza party now have what's called a supermajority in the Hungarian system. 2/3 majority in parliament enables them to change the constitution. So potentially they could start to wind things back in terms of re-establishing Hungary as a liberal rather than illiberal democracy, bringing some kind of plurality of voices into the media and winding back the judiciary. Of course, this is going to take a long, long time. It's potentially good news for Volodymyr Zelensky because Hungary, as you mentioned, not only got this attention from MAGA and a lot of praise from Trump, but also was, if you like, Putin's lead cheerleader within the European Union. And so this kind of potentially blocked funds towards from the EU to Ukraine. Now, that again may not change overnight because Magyar has been very cautious about, not wanting to sort of immediately say, yep, these funds are going to flow from the EU to Ukraine. But it's potentially it's a better move than Orbán winning again for sure. But I suppose we then need to sort of say, well, this is a centre-right government, so we can be happy, I guess, that illiberal democracy has taken a major hit. But as you say, social democrats should not necessarily dance in the streets right at this moment, except in the sense that illiberalism has taken a knock.
And also the association with Trump was a negative. I mean, JD Vance, I found it extraordinary that Vance was campaigning in Hungary effectively.
Well, look, first off, last year, the national security strategy of the US was set down, and they were quite explicit there that they were going to support what they call patriotic parties. And so the language coming from the White House and from Washington at the moment as regards Europe is about what is concerns civilizational erasure. which is their way of saying that immigration and basically Islam is ruining Europe. And so the bonds that the US are offering to Europe are not so much concerned with provision of security such as NATO used to offer, but they're more just like, well, we kind of like you because there are a lot of people with European backgrounds in the US. So these kind of civilizational narratives are very weak, but that's what Washington is offering Europeans at the moment. And the European radical right is very receptive to that. And that, of course, puts them kind of close to the other major power that is offering civilizational narratives, which is Russia. So you can see that this sort of tension within these European countries is actually sort of stretched between the MAGA US and Putin's Russia around civilizational issues. And so that was coming up. But you're absolutely right. Vance then was flown into Hungary to campaign on behalf of Orbán. So, an explicit intervention, sort of another norm that we try not to do, isn't it? Or to break, is that you don't interfere in other people's elections. But this was quite explicit. And he was left hanging, really. So there were two failures for Vance. One was to negotiate a ceasefire to this war that he didn't want in the Strait of Hormuz with Pakistan, or his Pakistani counterparts, I should say. And then the other was this sort of humiliation where, he rang Trump from the podium and they had a chat on the phone, and Trump said how brilliant Orbán was, and then the Hungarian electorate spoke otherwise. So not a good week for Vance if if we're feeling empathetic.
The problem, again, we go back to an initial point that we've all just briefly discussed, which is this notion that MAGA and Trump's operation are sophisticated. They've embarked on a nationalistic approach and dismantled what you best describe as America's biggest asset internationally, and that is that they were a country that, for all their faults, were the adult in the room when it came to trade, when it came to treating allies respectfully, and so on. They've completely dismantled it. And now they seem to think that they still have the same cachet and turn up like Vance turning up to Hungary thinking that, no, Hungarians are going to be big fans of us. Well, why? Why?
That's right. It's kind of interesting train of thought, isn't it? That there's a sort of a denial that there's any consequences for their actions, or maybe it'd be more accurate to say there's only the consequences that they intend for their actions, and that there aren't going to be a series of other responses, which kind of goes back to what I was saying about reactions on the right of politics in Canada. Well, you can sort of see something in Europe as well, is that people on the right go, and actually, I like being Hungarian, or I like being French, and I don't want the US to come in and like simply sort of tell me what to do. So yeah, it's again, it comes to that sort of sophistication of the operators. We haven't even talked about Pete Hegseth yet, but there is. It could be that the pressures of governing, and not just in the domestic sense, but in the sort of global and world ordering, are beginning to sort of like pull at the ideational and intellectual foundations of MAGA in government.
Yes, that's also playing out in your field of expertise. I think it's not an understatement to say that the UK-US relations, it's at a nadir. I can't remember. It's a nadir. And Trump's been out there repeatedly attacking Starmer after they seemed to initially have a cordial one-on-one relationship. Starmer survived Trump's visit to the UK, but he's been out there attacking him consistently as no Churchill for not supporting him in his Iranian adventure. How's that playing out in the UK?
Yeah.
I'm very interested. We just spoke about One Nation and the perils of cuddling up to the MAGA style politics. How's that playing out for Reform UK? I think they're still doing polling very, very well, along with the Greens. And Labor's still squeezed. The Tories are struggling. But how is the Trump bump 2.0 phenomenon playing out in the UK?
Yeah, there's a lot to sort of say there, Nick, and we need to talk about Peter Mandelson and in that as well. So I think, first of all, yes, the special relationship probably at a low ebb since the Suez Crisis of 1956.
Yeah.
Again, it comes. There's something here about like how do you manage the capriciousness of the US commander in chief, and what are the strategic alignments here? So on the one hand, let's not forget that AUKUS is bubbling along in the background, and that the UK is invested in this in the sense that they eventually get to build submarines should we ever reach that stage. And so that those kind of things are sort of tying the UK and the US together. But of course, the more that the US moves away from the kind of position within NATO that Kos was describing as, you know, like the part it played in sort of trade and security and holding the system together, the more the UK it finds itself strategically aligned with other European powers. And this whole kind of like notion of like middle powers that Mark Carney is leading and Australia ought to be receptive to, notwithstanding the traditional and very strong kind of knee-jerk reaction to support the US, like whatever that we discussed a bit earlier. So in the UK, initially one of the things that Starmer was only seen competent for was managing Trump, right? And this is going to lay the foundations of possibly his downfall. But it's been difficult, of course. So Trump doesn't understand that NATO is a defensive alliance, and that he thinks NATO is that everyone should support America when they ask for it. But that's not how it works. But he doesn't seem to know or care. Then there's the capriciousness that when you can go very quickly from thanks for giving me a state visit or 2 state visits, you splash some royalty around and Trump feels great, and then ergo Britain is good, to all right, you haven't helped me, in this conflict in the Straits of Hormuz, and therefore you're a terrible person, and I'm going to send some bad tweets about you and say some bad things, and like all that kind of like stuff just sort of fills the atmosphere and makes it difficult to manage diplomatically. Although, as we say, it might actually solidify support behind your own prime minister in whatever country you're in. It's tricky ground for Reform, who are busy supplanting the Conservatives in terms of polling support ever since Labour took power. So they initially also, that kind of knee-jerk radical right reaction was let's support Trump whatever he does, but they're also reading the tea leaves in the British public that this is not a popular war, Trump is not a popular president. We have to remember how unpopular Trump is everywhere except the US. And so, he doesn't have to do much to kind of make himself seem worse in the eyes of foreign electorates, and how that plays out depends on the relationship with the US. So Reform have kind of backtracked a little bit. But I think maybe there's something just to be said there about like the basis of support for Reform. So what we think is there are sort of 2 blocks in society that have been in the electorate that have been set by Brexit. There's sort of like Leave and Remain. And even though Brexit happened, almost 10 years ago now, it set the mold in terms of people's attitudes. And we haven't seen a shift since then. So we've got these 2 conservative and progressive, if you want to call it, blocks, but I think we've reached the limit of the crossover between those blocks. So now we're just like competing within those blocks, Reform and Conservative.
Yes. And this is the realignment. This is the realignment along class education lines, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
I've called it block voting. We could see these trends.
Yeah.
Yes, in the UK, but it's definitely here present in this country.
Yeah.
I often chuckle to myself when I hear some parts of the commentariat still pine for the days where there was massive swinging votes between left and right, especially in this country, when you just know that we've become extremely tribal now. And it'd be interesting just to hear your view of what, besides the leave and stay camps, what are the other drivers within the UK that have that really, really formed this? Because I think that will also give us a really good insight as to what's driving this sort of block voting environment right across most Western democracies at the moment.
Yeah, I think that block voting, and it means that you've set up a series of sort of internecine conflicts over votes within those blocks, and so that you see that playing out. And each of these has its own national peculiarity, and the British one or the English one was Brexit, and we know that those attitudes mapped onto all sorts of other things. So if you voted to leave, you're more likely to support bringing back hanging, for example, right? So you tend to get those clustering of views. And what's driving it is in some senses it's becoming viable. I think this also goes back to the Hungarian election, is that suddenly teasers seemed to have momentum that meant that a vote for an opposition party was actually a viable vote. And I think that we're starting to see that in the UK politics on the left with the Greens. That's been the way for reform. I
the
guess
reform vote is a bit complex, though, isn't it, Ben? And there is actually some crossover with the left-wing populism. Because what I understand is many Leave voters who back reform would also back renationalisation of key industries, which would be traditionally historically understood as a left-wing position. They want to see a strong British state.
Yeah. There's one element of this is that some Labour voters have switched to the reform and its predecessors. Yeah. And that switch happened like 10 years ago or so. But I think we might have seen the limits of of how much movement we can have from Labour voters, because it's actually, I think it can also be overstated. I think those Labour voters were significant, particularly when it came to winning the referendum to leave and subsequent elections, but they did move around a bit in elections that followed. So it's kind of difficult to say where we've ended up, and I think, though, on balance, it's worse for the Conservatives than it is for Labour. And I think that the threat of reform is worse for the Conservatives. I do want to sort of say that there is, of course, this difference between opinion polls and actual elections.
I was going to ask you, where do you think it actually ends up in? Is it 3 years' time that the general election is scheduled?
It's supposed to be 2029, but you never know, do you? I mean, it's like what people look at is, so give you a sense that Reform currently have 5 MPs in a 650 seat parliament, right? So that's not a strong position, but the point is they came second in 200 constituencies. So if you imagine a kind of a depressed Labour or Conservative vote, and that it could be that Labour voters have gone green, or and the Conservatives have switched to Reform, then you could see them under the first past the post system sneak in, possibly with a minority government, whatever. But there's still a long way to go. There's still a lot of scrutiny for voters to do over reform as they get into local councils and all these kind of forms of governance. And part of it reminds me of Pauline Hanson when she said, I'm not an elected politician, and that was part of the appeal. But of course, when it came to actually being a politician, she wasn't, a professional politician. So there's still a long way to run. And the Conservatives under Badenoch are finally, her leadership is kind of like consolidating, and you can't write the Conservative Party off. I mean, it's a very old party. It can pull a rabbit out of the hat when it needs to.
I think what you've just described is very similar to what we're seeing here in Australia with One Nation. So a portion of the One Nation base is now made up of former Labor voters. Labor's primary vote nationally is still relatively the same as it's been for the last 6 months, but there has been obviously some swap over of votes, which has kept their level of support pretty steady. But then when you look at this particular base of people that have moved from Labor to One Nation, they're very similar to the group you've just described in the UK. And Nick, you briefly touched on it, and that is that these people are the ones most likely to want a renationalisation of the industry. They're also most likely to respond against the closeness of Trump to the brand, and what we know in this country, they are absolutely most likely to respond negatively towards One Nation if you highlight Pauline Hanson's industrial relations background. It burns that vote to the ground, literally, in all our research that we've done. And you could see, I think the ACTU here in Australia has already started that campaign. That is absolutely laser beam focused on that, what we call the red One Nation voter. And they are far more softer, and again, Ben, to your point, than former Conservative voters. So Reform has the same dynamic where it's soft underbelly is basically people they've pillaged from the Labor side of politics, but it's Praetorian Guard of former Conservative voters. Yeah, same as One Nation.
Yeah, absolutely, Kos, I agree. And the Praetorian Guard are also former Conservative MPs. So they're high-profile people, have been the right of the Conservative Party who've moved across and now sort of lining up with Nigel Farage and for photo ops. And there are some elections in May, local elections in England, but we've got elections to the Scottish and Welsh parliaments. And all of these will be interesting to see how Reform does. And again, the kind of like intranational politics in the UK plays out here. Reform are possibly doing quite well in Wales, but so are the Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru, right? In Scotland, we could see the SNP consolidate its lead, which despite everything would be almost a 2-decade dominance of Scottish politics. And again, then we get separatist parties in charge of politics in Scotland. I would also say that Reform, the UK in Reform UK is really weak. They're essentially they're not concerned about keeping the United Kingdom together. They're kind of really very relaxed about that, and they've got this sort of rhetorical Britishness and a kind of a British nativism that they align themselves with in terms of the far right activity in the United Kingdom.
It's English nationalism.
It's kind of English, really. Yeah, it's. I mean, I'm not understating support in Wales, but even that support is amongst English speakers in Wales. So there's something significant in there, I reckon. But yes, that kind of. I wonder if we've just gone as far as we can go in terms of Labour voters switching, and that explains the culture wars. There was a lot of culture wars to try and keep older male voters aligned with either the Conservatives or Reform, and pushing hard on same-sex toilets. And but Gaza played into this as well, of course. So,
so how do you see? I mean, the Scottish and Welsh national elections, they're both being held on the 7th of May. Correct. They would seem to me to be really important electoral stress tests, and they're going to bear out this, what's been described as a 5-6 party system. Is it a case in Wales that it's played versus Reform, and that Labor have, just to give listeners a sense, like Wales is just about the most successful Labor Party on earth. Traditionally,
that's true. Yeah,
in Wales, and a Scottish Labor, this is the party. This is Keir Hardie, Gordon Brown. It's disintegrated. So, how do you actually see those, or is it just so uncertain? How do you see the Greens polling? I understood they were, according to polls, polling fairly strongly in Scotland, unless I'm mistaken.
I think, yes, to go to your point about the historic significance of Wales. Wales, of course, is a relatively small nation of 2 million people, but from a Labour history perspective, it is rock solid. It has been rock solid Labour for 100 years or more. So if we were going to track the decline of centrist parties, and in particularly Labour parties, looking at what happens in Wales on the 7th of May is actually going to be quite significant, because if the Labour vote collapses there and it becomes a Reform Plaid Cymru contest, then something significant will have shifted. I mean, we'll all need to see that repeated, of course, before we can say that for definite, but nonetheless, it is looking important. Labour was similarly strong in Scotland, not perhaps quite as dominant, but nonetheless, in the last, say, 40 years or so, for a long time, Labour was the dominant party. That collapse, Labour's collapse, happened there earlier, about 10 years ago, and they've done quite well. But I think a lot of people who were invested in this got excited in the sort of the post-Brexit elections of 2017-19. We returned to this two-party politics because lots of people are voting for Corbyn, lots of people are voting for the Conservatives, and the results didn't fall that way, but the support was there. But that seemed to me almost like the sort of like the staggering of someone who's concussed rather than like a complete revival. And I think we are heading towards what you referred to, Nick, in the United Kingdom, a sort of fragmentation of a five-party system, whereby and how that's going to play out in first past the post is that we're probably going to have even sort of weaker, if you like, I hesitate to, electoral mandates, but weaker support for the governing party than we've seen before. And that might be okay if people like coalitions, but it also might not be okay if people decide that minority government's the only way to go. So, and the Greens are the thing I think about the Greens is their membership, which has been surging.
But 200,000, 200,000. That's, I mean, that's
for a modern
big.
Political. We've moved out of the way of mass political parties, haven't we? Yeah. But for a sort of a cadre party. That's pretty good. The thing is, I wonder where they've come from, because a lot of these are disaffected Corbynistas who have moved, decided that the Your Party thing, I don't know if listeners are familiar with this, but Corbyn and Zara Sultana, an ex-Labour MP, had enough of control freakery coming from Labour's central office, set up their own party. Well, of course, Corbyn had already been expelled, but set up their own party, which was called square brackets Your Party, and the idea was that the members would come up with the name. Well, they couldn't agree on anything, so they came.
It was Monty Python-esque.
Right. And if you had, if you had to write a sort of a parody of left-wing factional politics, you would just look at this, because they fell out with each other and they got bogged down in process and blah blah blah. Anyway. A lot of initial support there, I think, has gone to the Greens.
Yes.
And I wonder how this is going to sort of play out on the ground in terms of electoral campaigning, where you've got basically Corbynistas and environmentalists, and they may not get on. But nonetheless, they've definitely got the wind in their sails. They scored a very significant by-election recently up in Manchester.
And not in North London.
Not in North London, no. And they were able to, they were able to get out of that kind of geographic and social base by not talking about the environment. It was all about cost of living and
economy.
All the stuff that a Labour Party, you might think should be talking about. So they've done all right there. How they'll go in Scotland is because the Scottish Green Party is a slightly different party. I mean, and again, the UK is not a federal system. It's a asymmetrically devolved system. It's a kind of there's a lot of ad hocery, and it doesn't necessarily equate to the Australian sort of structured federal system. So things could go differently there. But if you're a social democrat in Scotland, you've kind of got the SNP to vote for, even though it's a broader church than that, and it's got some it has positioned itself where the Labour Party used to be.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to be suffering from the travails of government that are besetting the Labour Party in England. And this is where we need to talk about Starmer's leadership and Mandelson. But
yes, I wanted to ask electoral stress tests. If both contests go absolutely pear-shaped for Labour, what will that mean for Starmer's leadership? Which is it's amazing. I mean, I know it was a sort of what Kos and I and others call a shallow majority, but it was still the 2024 victory was in seat terms was big, and he looked prime ministerial from the get-go, but his leadership has been embroiled in chaos and instability from the get-go. And Mandelson has been a big part of that story of late. I mean, the decision to send him to to the States as ambassador just seemed absurd at the time, and even worse in retrospect. So what would it mean for Starmer's leadership, which is precarious, to put it politely?
I think that term "shallow majority" is right. And what surprised me was there was an absolute unwillingness to spend that political capital of the number of seats. You might sort of think,
and also do dumb things like whacking pensioners,
absolutely,
energy subsidies,
and that's where the political capital should have been spent. It said, well, okay, the Treasury is saying we need to save money, and we've got this narrative about how terrible things are. We thought they were bad; they're even worse, and it was a Tory's fault. That kind of strategy lasts you about 2 weeks, I think, in politics, and then you have to come up with what are we doing about it. But they went on and on about this, and all of those things like eroded there was no honeymoon period in that regard. So the political capital was invested in the seats in Parliament, not in the actual vote. And whether that scared Labour strategists, there was too much of a kind of a literal attempt to ape reform on immigration. I think for the reasons we've talked about, the red reform voters, to take Kos's analogy, and then miscalculations. So there seems to be sort of this problem with political judgment for Starmer, and by sending, and here again we come back to Trump, to try and deal with this erratic figure in the White House, the idea that you would sort of come back to someone who had an ambivalent position within the Labour Party, to say the least, in Mandelson, and sort of say, well, Trump seems to like him, he can handle this. And the current point of contention is, well, what did Starmer know, and has he lied to Parliament about the kind of security vetting around Peter Mandelson's appointment as the ambassador to Washington? Seems to just underscore questions about his judgment. And I think if we head into a series of poor electoral outcomes for the Labour Party on the 7th of May, depending on how this goes with Starmer, there will be a lot of people emboldened in the Labour Party, parliamentary party, thinking something's got to change, and that probably means Starmer's got to go. So there's still, if we assume that there's 3 years for an election, that's still enough time to sort of turn it around. A lot of people won't have been focusing on this kind of thing yet, but I think poor outcomes on the 7th of May are not going to be good for Keir Starmer.
The fundamental problem for them is that they've come into government. They are overwhelmingly staffed and run by people who come from a different political era. We're now living in a political environment that does not reward managerial classes, right? And Starmer is a really good example of that. He's a child of that era, and we could see that across most democracies now, where the old systems that are coming under enormous pressure, and those who cannot decouple their thinking from that old era are finding themselves in deep trouble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
indeed they are. And we're going to find out a lot about UK politics on the 7th of May and across the year. Ben Wellings, thank you so much for joining us and providing us with a glimpse of your expertise and wisdom. We'd love to have you back on the show. Check in, see whether Keir Starmer is still Prime Minister of the UK. Thank you, Kung Fu Kos. Thank you, Curtinistas. Don't forget, check us out on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and we will see you next week. Ciao and arrivederci.